There's something profoundly satisfying about claiming one's own space, a sanctuary where every tool has its own place, and every quiet afternoon is undisturbed by outside interference. For Officer James Johnson, that space was his garage. It wasn't merely a place to park his car, it was his retreat, a workshop passed down from his father and grandfather, where he tinkered on small projects, stored his prized tools, and found solace from the demands of his hectic job. For years, nothing ever disturbed the calm of his afternoons, until Karen Mitchell decided to stake her claim. They had thought a petty HOA fine would make him bow down to their power-hungry demands. They never imagined that they'd picked a fight with the chief of police. But what happens when James begins to uncover an illegal operation targeting the community's hard-working first responders, and when he decides that it's time for the hunter to become the hunted? This is the story of that day and the events that followed, a tale of entitlement, corruption, and the eventual reclaiming of one's space. A routine day disrupted that morning, as the sun rose slowly over the quiet, tree-lined streets of Willow Creek, an upscale suburban neighborhood in Texas, known for its perfectly manicured lawns and pristine white picket fences. James stepped out of his car, his uniform crisp and his coffee warm in hand. For 15 years, his property had remained exactly as he had kept it. The grass was healthy and well-maintained, and his garage, a beacon of order and organization, was his personal sanctuary. Nothing could have prepared him for what he saw that day. Under his windshield wiper, glinting in the early light, was something bright green. At first, James assumed it was a stray takeout menu or a piece of litter. But as he bent down to inspect it, his heart sank. It was an HOA violation notice, $79 for improper lawn maintenance. The very notion was absurd. His lawn looked exactly as it had for all the years he'd lived there. Sure, it wasn't a golf course, but it was neat, green, and cared for with the same meticulous attention that had defined his life. The fine, however, was a symbol of something far more insidious, a challenge from those who believed they could dictate every detail of his personal domain. Karen Mitchell, the enforcer, almost immediately after noticing the violation notice, the sound of high heels clicking on the sidewalk reached James's ears. He turned to see Karen Mitchell approaching. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood and president of the local HOA board, had earned a reputation for enforcing rules with an iron fist. With her perfectly styled blonde hair, designer handbag swinging from her arm, and a tablet clutched in her hand, she exuded authority. Ever since she moved into Willow Creek 6 months ago and quickly secured a board position, she had been on a mission to ensure everyone followed her rigid vision of perfection. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," Karen said, her voice sugary sweet yet edged with an unmistakable authority that made James's blood boil. "I noticed a violation on your property. According to Section 7, Paragraph 3 of our HOA guidelines, your lawn exceeds the maximum allowed height by half an inch." James regarded her with measured calm, though his heart pounded in his chest. "My lawn has always met the standards I've maintained for the past 15 years, he replied, evenly. "I assure you, it's in excellent condition." Karen barely lifted her eyes from her tablet. "The guidelines are clear," she said curtly. "And if the fine isn't paid within 72 hours, it doubles. Also, those garden gnomes, your very sentimental garden gnomes, are not on the approved decoration list." Those garden gnomes, cherished mementos collected over many years in honor of his late wife, had adorned his garden long before Karen's arrival. New board, new rules. Karen waved her tablet dismissively as she turned and strode away, convinced that she was ushering the neighborhood into a modern era of strict compliance. The small injustices add up in the days that followed. The atmosphere on Willow Creek grew increasingly tense. James soon learned that Karen wasn't merely enforcing arbitrary rules, she was targeting specific residents with a deliberate, calculated cruelty. Neighbors began to share their stories. Sarah Thompson, an ER nurse from 3 houses down, had been harassed for having her garbage bins out a few minutes too long after a grueling night shift. Mark, the local firefighter, had been fined repeatedly for a children's basketball hoop that had hung undisturbed for 5 years. An elderly couple received citations for naturally grown rose bushes, and even a local teacher was cited for parking his car in his own driveway because it was deemed unsightly. At home, James scrolled through the neighborhood Facebook group. Complaints about Karen piled up like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, each one a small injustice that, taken together, painted a picture of systematic abuse of power. It wasn't long before James's instincts, honed over 25 years in law enforcement, told him that Karen's actions were not only petty, they were part of a broader plan to bully the community's most hard-working residents. 2 days after that lime green ticket, the situation escalated further. After finishing a brutal double shift handling a bank robbery downtown, James returned home only to find 2 black SUVs, with HOA security splashed across their sides, completely blocking his driveway. Through his windshield, he watched as Karen strutted across his front lawn in a designer suit, her tablet in hand, snapping pictures of everything, from his garden hose to his welcome mat. Each flash of her camera added fuel to his simmering anger, but he maintained his composure. 20 years on the force had taught him that losing his temper would solve nothing. "Excuse me," James called out as he stepped from his car. "You're blocking my driveway, I need to get to my garage." Karen spun around, her blonde hair flowing perfectly as though styled by a professional commercial. "Well, if it isn't Mr. Johnson, our neighborhood's most persistent rule breaker," she said, tapping her tablet with long red nails. "Let's see. Unpaid fine for lawn height violations, unapproved garden gnome placement, and now, non-regulation mailbox color." James couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity. "Non-regulation mailbox color? My mailbox has been white for 15 years," he explained, noting that the new guidelines stated that all mailboxes must be painted pristine pearl white from the Anderson Paint Company. "Mine is classic white, a completely different shade." For a split second, Karen's smug smile faltered. Sensing an opportunity, James pulled out his phone and began recording. "I understand you're new to the neighborhood," he said in a measured tone, "but these security vehicles are parked illegally. They're blocking access to my property, which is a violation of City Ordinance 20-345. Karen's smile flickered for just a moment before she regained her composure. "I have full authority as an HOA board member to enforce our community standards," she retorted, gesturing to 2 men in ill-fitting uniforms, leaning against their SUVs. Yet, James's trained eye caught something odd about their badges. They looked almost like police badges, but not quite. In his experience, he knew every licensed security company in the area, and Mitchell Security Solutions wasn't one of them. Taking a deep breath, James tried once more. "Look, I get that you're trying to maintain property values, but blocking someone's driveway over a $79 fine isn't just unreasonable, it's illegal. I'd hate to have to escalate this further." Karen's face flushed a deep red, matching the polish on her manicured nails. "Is that a threat, Mr. Johnson?" she snapped. "Because I have photos documenting every violation on your property, and the HOA board will be very interested in your aggressive attitude." She then turned to the security guards. "Make a note of his threatening behavior," she ordered, as they fumbled with their notepads. James noticed that their shoulder patches were peeling off. They looked as if they'd been printed at a local copy shop. Something was clearly amiss, and his instincts told him there was far more to this than petty fines. He pulled up the city's business license database on his phone. Within minutes, his suspicions were confirmed. No licensed security company was registered under Karen's name or her brother's, whom he'd seen at the last HOA meeting in similar attire. Just then, Mrs. Garcia from next door burst out in her nurse's scrubs. "Chief Johnson, I'm so glad you're here. They've been blocking my driveway too, and I'm late for my hospital shift," she cried. Karen's expression shifted momentarily at the sound of the word chief. Instead of backing down, however, she lifted her chin higher. "Your title doesn't matter here, Chief Johnson. HOA rules apply to everyone equally," she declared. "I'm sorry," James replied coolly, "but I need to document a few more violations before processing additional fines for your uncooperative behavior." With her clipboard clutched tightly, Karen marched away, leaving James to piece together the full extent of her abuses. Uncovering the corruption, in the days that followed, James began to uncover a pattern. It wasn't just that Karen was overzealous about enforcing minor infractions, it was that she was systematically targeting the homes of the community's essential workers. Sarah Thompson, the ER nurse, wasn't the only one. Mark, the local firefighter, had been fined repeatedly for his child's basketball hoop, even though it had hung there for 5 years without issue. An elderly couple was slapped with citations for their unapproved rose bushes, and even the local teacher received a violation for parking in his own driveway, because his car was considered unsightly. Late one afternoon, a text from Tom, James's deputy, confirmed his worst fears. "Chief, remember that flooding issue last spring? Karen's brother's company just won the contract for drainage repair, at 3 times the cost of other bids." James leaned back in his chair. Karen had laughed in his face when he tried to reason with her earlier. Now he understood, these rules were not about fairness, they were a power play, a systematic harassment of those who truly served the community. Determined to expose the corruption, James headed to the county clerk's office. With the help of Mrs. Rodriguez, a friendly clerk, he pulled HOA registration documents from the past 6 months. As he flipped through the pages, one glaring omission jumped out. Karen had never disclosed her family connection to the security company during the bidding process, a clear conflict of interest. Then came an even bigger revelation. Karen's home business registration revealed that she had been running a daycare center from her garage, caring for up to 6 children at a time. This was a blatant violation of HOA rules, yet it was exactly the same rules she wielded to fine neighbors for having home offices. Worse still, she lacked the proper state licensing for child care. The evidence kept mounting. Mark the firefighter sent photos showing Karen's security company vehicles parked in fire lanes around the neighborhood, an act that not only violated city ordinances, but also endangered lives by blocking emergency access. James spent the afternoon gathering evidence. Property maps showed that Karen had extended her back fence 2 feet beyond her property line. Security camera footage from his cruiser documented instances where her company had blocked emergency vehicle access, and the HOA's financial records revealed that she had been pushing the board to increase fines, while funneling all security contracts to her brother's unlicensed company. Every piece of evidence painted a damning picture of systematic abuse of power. James meticulously made copies of every document, storing them both digitally and in hard copy. Years of police work had taught him that thorough documentation was key. Just as he was finalizing his case, Officer Rodriguez rushed into his office with urgent news. "Chief, you won't believe this. Karen's security company just tried to boot Dr. Thompson's car from the emergency room entrance. He was rushing in for critical surgery." James's blood boiled, but he maintained his composure. This incident was the final piece he needed to expose the full extent of Karen's misconduct. That evening, as James sat at his desk reviewing the growing mountain of evidence, his phone buzzed with a message. Karen had submitted a proposal for expanded security measures, and an emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the next night. A smile crept onto his face. This was the perfect moment. Sometimes, the best investigations are the ones where you let your target walk right into the trap they've set for others. The HOA showdown. The emergency HOA meeting was packed. In a stuffy conference room at the community center, homeowners gathered, many with expressions of frustration, fear, and barely concealed anger. Karen stood at the front, her designer suit immaculate, her tablet clutched like a scepter. She launched into a speech about her new community safety program, talking about hiring additional security guards and installing cameras on every street, all in the name of protecting property values. The tone was pompous and overbearing, yet underneath, the room simmered with resentment. After Karen finished her speech, James rose from his seat. The familiar weight of his badge in his pocket lent him authority as he walked to the front of the room. "Before we vote on these new security measures," he began in a measured tone, "there's something everyone needs to know. I'm Chief Anderson, and I've been investigating some very concerning issues in our community." Karen's eyes narrowed as she recognized him in uniform. James pulled out a stack of documents, property records, business licenses, photos, and connected his phone to the projector. The screen lit up with undeniable evidence, photographs of an unlicensed daycare operation, running out of Karen's home, copies of business registrations showing that her brother owned a security company operating without proper permits, and detailed maps that documented how she had extended her property boundaries illegally. The room erupted in murmurs. "That's against both HOA rules and state regulations," James stated firmly. "While you fine Sarah Thompson for trivial infractions, you're systematically targeting our community's first responders, nurses, and firefighters. People who work long hours and deserve respect." One by one, homeowners shared their stories. An elderly couple recounted how they'd been fined for naturally grown rose bushes. A local teacher described how he'd been cited for parking in his own driveway because his car was considered unsightly. The collective anger in the room grew until Mr. Jenkins, a longtime resident and senior board member, called for an emergency vote. Hands shot up as the homeowners, united in their determination, voted unanimously. Karen Mitchell was removed from the board and banned from ever serving again. As Karen stormed out of the room, her designer handbag swinging wildly, she turned back with tears of rage streaming down her face and shouted, "This isn't over." But the community's unity was now undeniable. A final, unforgettable lesson, even as the meeting adjourned and the room began to clear. James knew he wasn't finished. There was one final twist he had planned, one that would etch this story into neighborhood legend forever. Unlike the typical guardians of property, James had a secret that few in Willow Creek knew about, a legally maintained collection of exotic animals. Deep on his property, hidden behind a reinforced fence and a discreet gate, was a secure, well-kept pond that housed two massive crocodiles, Goliath and Viper. These creatures were not mere pets, they were awe-inspiring animals kept under strict safety protocols, a private exhibit that James had carefully curated over the years. Normally, Goliath and Viper were confined to their pond, but with Karen's authority in shambles and her abusive tactics exposed, James decided it was time for one final, unequivocal statement. During a community event held in celebration of the HOA's disintegration and the restoration of common sense, James orchestrated a dramatic reveal. As the residents gathered in his front yard, enjoying the open space that had once been marred by petty fines, Karen, undeterred by her removal from the board, returned in a futile attempt to reclaim some semblance of power. With her tablet in hand and determination etched on her face, she began snapping photos once more. That was the moment James chose to act. He calmly walked to the side of his property and activated a hidden switch that released Goliath and Viper from their enclosure. The heavy metal gate swung open, and the two enormous crocodiles glided out onto the lawn. Their scales shone in the late afternoon sun, and their eyes were fixed in a cold, unblinking stare. Goliath, the larger and more imposing of the two, moved deliberately to block Karen's path, while Viper positioned himself at her flank. For several long, agonizing moments, the only sounds in the yard were the slow, measured movements of the crocodiles and the collective gasp of the gathered residents. Karen's confident mask finally crumbled. Her eyes widened in terror as she realized the full extent of her miscalculation. "Get back!" James's voice rang out, steady and resolute. "This is my property, and if you ever try to encroach on it again, you'll face the consequences." Karen's once imposing persona was reduced to desperate pleas. "Please, please, get me out of here," she cried, her voice trembling with fear. The sight of the crocodiles was more than enough to break her spirit. The community watched in stunned silence as the woman who had once ruled with an iron fist was humbled in the most unexpected way. Aftermath and the ripple effect news of Karen's downfall spread like wildfire. In Willow Creek, the story quickly became a modern fable, an example of how unchecked entitlement eventually meets its match. Neighbors recounted in hushed tones how the once feared HOA president had been reduced to pleading for her freedom, her reign of terror ended by the very property she had once tried to control. The consequences for Karen were severe. The HOA swiftly fined her for unauthorized use of another resident's property and suspended her community privileges for an entire year. No pool access, no clubhouse reservations, nothing. Her reputation, once bolstered by her unyielding authority, was now in ruins. Her husband, dismayed and disillusioned, filed for divorce. Word spread quickly, and even when Karen tried to join another HOA board in a neighboring town, her history preceded her, and she was shunned. But the impact went far beyond Karen's personal downfall. The evidence that James had gathered exposed a corrupt system that had long targeted the community's first responders and other hard-working residents. The pattern was undeniable. Through careful documentation, public records, business licenses, photographs, and security footage, James had shown that Karen's fines and rules were not about preserving property values, but about exerting control over those who couldn't easily challenge her authority. In the weeks that followed, the community began to heal. Homeowners, emboldened by the truth, started sharing their own stories of harassment. Mark the firefighter recounted how he had been repeatedly fined for a basketball hoop that had hung for years without issue. Sarah Thompson, the ER nurse, no longer received absurd citations for minor infractions. The collective outrage forced the HOA board to re-examine its policies, and many residents began to demand that rules be applied fairly, without targeting those who worked long, irregular hours. At a series of community meetings, neighbors came together to discuss reform. The once dreaded HOA was forced to make sweeping changes. A new oversight committee was established to ensure that fines were issued only when necessary, and that they were applied equally. The phrase "power trip" became a cautionary tale, a reminder that no one was above the law. The transformation was not instantaneous, but gradually, Willow Creek became a community where respect and fairness were valued above rigid, oppressive rules. One particularly memorable day, as James was watering his meticulously maintained lawn, measured precisely at 3.5 inches tall, a young neighbor approached him with a handmade card. The crayon drawing depicted him in his police uniform, standing in front of a house painted in a riot of free, vibrant colors. The simple message read, "Thank you for making our neighborhood happy again." That card now hung on his desk at the station, a daily reminder that sometimes, the smallest victories can spark monumental change. For James, the experience reinforced a simple truth: true peace comes from owning and defending one's own space. His garage was more than just a workshop, it was a testament to his independence, a legacy passed down through generations, and a symbol of his unyielding commitment to his community. Every time he pulled into his driveway, he double-checked the locked garage door, secure in the knowledge that his sanctuary was protected. For Karen, the ordeal served as a harsh lesson in humility. Trapped for nearly a week in a sealed garage, forced to endure isolation, hunger, and the degrading reality of her own arrogance, she learned that entitlement has a steep price. Her desperate texts, recorded by security cameras and later broadcast as evidence, became a stark reminder that no one is above the law. Her reputation, her career, and her personal life were forever tarnished by the experience. A new chapter for Willow Creek in the aftermath of the showdown. The transformation in Willow Creek was palpable. Neighbors began to speak openly about the abuses of power that had plagued the community for far too long. A sense of unity emerged as residents, especially those who had been unfairly targeted, first responders, nurses, firefighters, teachers, banded together to demand accountability. The corrupt practices of the HOA were exposed in all their detail, and the community rallied behind the principle that rules must be applied fairly and with compassion. The public outcry led to the formation of a citizens' oversight committee that worked alongside the local government to review and revise HOA regulations. New policies were implemented to ensure transparency, and fines were scaled back to reasonable amounts. The experience became a turning point, a case study in how a united community could stand up against bullying and corruption. Meanwhile, the legend of the crocodile confrontation grew. While most residents remembered the crocodiles, Goliath and Viper as the silent enforcers of Jack's boundaries, their presence became a symbol of resistance against abuse of power. Children would whisper about the day the crocodiles came out to protect a man's property, and adults recalled it as a turning point in their community. For many, it wasn't just a story about a petty fine, it was a reminder that when someone tries to take what isn't theirs, they risk being caught in a trap of their own making. Karen's fate, though personally tragic, spurred a larger movement. Her actions and subsequent downfall led to a public re-evaluation of what community governance should look like. The residents of Willow Creek began to demand more equitable treatment, and to insist that the true purpose of any homeowners association was to protect the rights and well-being of all residents, not to serve the interests of a few power-hungry individuals. In time, the neighborhood saw a marked improvement in community relations. Neighbors who had once lived in fear of arbitrary fines now organized block parties, community cleanups, and neighborhood watch programs that operated transparently and democratically. The transformation was gradual, but the impact was undeniable. What had once been a battleground of petty rules and oppressive fines had become a model for community cooperation and respect. Reflections on justice and space. Standing on his porch on a cool evening, James Johnson looked out over the familiar expanse of his property. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over his well-tended lawn, and the sturdy, unyielding walls of his garage, a symbol of his enduring independence. His heart swelled with a quiet pride. He knew that his sanctuary had been defended, not by brute force, but by standing up for what was right. Every piece of evidence, every carefully documented violation, had contributed to a victory that resonated far beyond his own property. In his reflections, James recalled the day that everything changed, the day when a petty violation notice set in motion a chain of events that exposed corruption, forced a community to confront its values, and ultimately reclaimed the dignity of those who served it. He remembered the humiliation on Karen's face, the defiant stares of his neighbors, and the overwhelming sense of unity that had emerged from the ashes of conflict. For him, owning and defending his space was more than a matter of pride, it was a testament to the power of standing up against injustice. And though the memory of Karen's downfall was etched in the minds of Willow Creek's residents, it was also a reminder that true power lies not in imposing one's will, but in ensuring that every individual's rights are respected. Epilogue, a legacy of change. Years later, the story of that tumultuous period in Willow Creek became local legend, a modern fable recounted with a mix of humor, sorrow, and pride. Children grew up hearing about the day the crocodiles came out to protect a man's space, and adults remembered it as the moment when the community reclaimed its voice. The lessons learned during those difficult days continued to shape neighborhood policies, and the spirit of unity prevailed. James continued his work as chief of police, but he also became a symbol of steadfast independence. His garage, with its perfectly arranged tools and quiet corners, remained his sanctuary. And every time he pulled into his driveway, he did so with the assurance that his space was truly his own. As for Karen, her career and reputation were forever marred by the events that transpired. Attempts to join another HOA board were met with caution and rejection, and she gradually faded from the spotlight. Yet, even in her fall, her story served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that unchecked arrogance and the abuse of power have consequences that echo far beyond the individual. In the end, the battle for personal space and community justice in Willow Creek was not just about a petty fine or a disputed lawn height, it was about dignity, respect, and the power of a united community. The transformation of the neighborhood, driven by the courage of ordinary people standing up to tyranny, became a legacy of hope and a reminder that every individual deserves to live and work in peace. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more real-life lessons on standing up for what's yours. Comment below with where you're watching from and let us know, have you ever had to defend your own space? Remember, when you try to take what isn't yours, sometimes the consequences are far more than you ever imagined.